morning, happy May. My name is Liz Zelzer. I'm Scholarly Communications Librarian here at MCW Libraries. And I'm joined by Wes Rude, who's the Information Systems Architect with CTSI. And today I'm going to be presenting Tracking Scholarly Publications. If you have questions as we go along, please feel free to put them in the chat, or I'll pause at various times where you can unmute and ask your question. So tracking publications for your research team is something that's important to do for a variety of reasons. So first of all, one of the reasons that you might want to track your research publications is to demonstrate the scholarly productivity of your team. So how many items are your team publishing each year or quarter? And then once your publications have been tracked, you can use the publications to find metrics to show the research impact of your group. So you might collect citation metrics or alt metrics on the publications, or just the types of journals your group is publishing in, and this can show research impact. You might also want to track publications to support grant applications and renewals, where you have to show what sort of scholarly research is being produced per the grant that your team has been granted. And you can also track publications and use that information for individual and team evaluation. So whatever reasons you have for collecting the publication information for your team, I hope this webinar will give you some resources on how to do that. So I'm going to start out the webinar with talking about some of the logistics of searching for scholarly publications. So there are some challenges you might run into, and I'll just kind of bring up these challenges and give you some things to think about when you're setting up these publication searches. I'm going to demonstrate how to set up and search for publications, set up alerts and search for publications in PubMed and Scopus, which are two literature databases. And then I'll also talk about how you can use the FCD, or the Faculty Collaboration Database, to facilitate this process in a very simplified way. So to start with, one of the challenges, or some of the challenges you might encounter when you're searching for publications are searching for authors. So in your group, you might have people with unique names. I'm the only Elizabeth Selzer out there that's publishing under that name, Elizabeth Selzer. So when I go into databases like PubMed or Scopus or Google Scholar and I type in my name, I can feel pretty confident that all the articles that show up belong to me. But people in your research group might have a name like Joseph Lee. This is a pretty common name. You can see here, if I search Scopus for this author, there's over 306 results. And at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill alone, there are 7 Joseph Lees, 7 potentially unique Joseph Lees. So having a unique name can pose a challenge when you're trying to come up with publications that belong to that person. In another scenario, you might have a person on your team who sometimes uses their middle name when they publish and sometimes uses an initial. People on your team may undergo name changes and their publications may reflect that. They may use one version of their name and then a later version of their name. People on your team may also be coming from different institutions, different medical schools, different residency and fellowship programs. They may come from different institutions. So linking affiliations to that name can be a challenge. So this here, searching for this particular person can be challenging because of the different variations of their name and the different affiliations that they've been associated with. And when you put it all together and you've got a research team with people who have common names and people who have name changes and people who have unique names, it can be a complicated process the more people you add to that group whose publications you need to look up. So that's one thing to be aware of when you're creating these searches. Another thing you have to consider when you're searching for publications for your team is where you're going out to find that information. So I've got a chart here that shows 4 different places you can go to find information, and this chart here gives a little context on what you can find in each resource and the difference in coverage and content and such. So starting out with PubMed, this is probably everyone's go-to resource for finding scholarly publications, especially for MCW authors who are mostly publishing in the biomedical sciences. So PubMed's a great place to start. And just be aware that when you're searching in PubMed, you're looking in the contents of around 8,500 journals that are currently published and around 9,000 books and reports that are published by the National Library of Medicine and other places like that. So 8,000 journals represents a lot of journals, but it's not everything in the world of scholarly literature. But you're getting the core journals, the majority of journals that our researchers are publishing in. And some of the advantages of searching in PubMed are that you can set up search alerts for your team. You can use the My Bibliography function to create a repository for your research publications or the publications of your research group. So that's a function within PubMed and the NIH. It's a place where you can deposit citations and use that as kind of a holding place or a storage location for those citations. And the FCD also PubMed also integrates with the FCD, and we'll get into how that works a little later on. Scopus is another database you might use to search for publications. And you can see here the number of titles indexed in Scopus is far greater than what you'll find in PubMed. Scopus also goes outside of biomedical sciences into all academic disciplines. So if you're working with research teams who are publishing on topics like some of the harder sciences or sociology, criminology, urban design, climatology, things like that, you might not find all of their publications in PubMed, but Scopus would be another place to look for those. Some advantages of searching in Scopus are that Scopus has a really nice author profiling system that we'll take a look at in a little bit. That helps you identify publications by your research authors. You can also set up search alerts in Scopus, and Scopus integrates with the FCD. Web of Science is yet another database that I've used to collect citation information. It's similar in scope to Scopus in that it has over 21,000 currently indexed journals. So these are journals that when they publish new content, they send their the content information of each issue to Scopus and Web of Science and PubMed, so that it's included in the database. And if you perform a search in any of these, you can find article information. Scopus also covers all sorts of academic disciplines. And Scopus and PubMed, instead of just covering articles, which PubMed strictly searches articles, you can find other types of content like book chapters and conference materials. Sometimes theses are included in these resources as well. Scopus is really strong with their affiliation searches. So when I want to search for MCW publications, I like to use, Web of Science has a strong affiliation search. When I'm searching for articles by the MCW community, I like to use Web of Science for that. But I can't necessarily get down to departments within MCW. It's either all of MCW or nothing with that affiliation search. And I can set up search alerts in Web of Science. And then finally, another place you can go to look for published literature is Google Scholar. The scope of Scholar is not immediately available, so Google doesn't share this information with us. So we can't tell how many journals are currently indexed in Google Scholar. That's proprietary information from their team. The publication types you'll find in Google Scholar go beyond articles and conference papers. And anything Scholar finds that looks like it could be scholarly literature, they put into the database. And sometimes this includes PowerPoints or documents, slides that you might find posted on the internet. So it's a whole lot of different types of publications that you find in Google Scholar. Google Scholar also allows for author profiles to be created and for search alerts to be set up. The point of showing this chart here is to demonstrate that there's different places to search for this information. There isn't one place where you can go to collect all of the information in like one tidy package. There are sometimes I find articles that show up only in Web of Science and not in the other 4 resources listed here. Sometimes they'll show up in PubMed and Scopus, but not anywhere else. So it's really kind of a game to be able to find all of the publications that your team has published. There's a lot of overlap between all of these databases as well. So if you, typically I like to rely on at least 2 of these when I'm performing searches for groups of people. And usually I go to PubMed and Scopus and feel pretty good about collecting the majority of the content there. The research teams who I send this information to always have a couple extra one-offs that weren't identified in these searches, but the majority of the information can be found in a couple of these databases. So I'm going to pause here and see if there's any questions about the databases or what I've presented so far. Okay, so let's move on to the process of tracking publications. And this is the workflow that I use when I'm asked to come up with a list of publications for a team. So the first thing is to determine which authors to track, and usually I get a spreadsheet or a Word document or just a list of people. So that part's pretty straightforward. Next, I decide which sources to search, and here I need to be a little, I might have to work with the team to understand what they would like to see represented in the search. And as I showed in the previous slide, there's different places you can go to find this information. Specifically, Scopus and PubMed are 2 of my go-to resources, as well as I don't typically use Google Scholar, but that is a source you could use. And then the FCD. And after I go through this process here of showing how to do searches in Scopus and PubMed, I'll bring it back to the FCD and show how that is really convenient at doing this process for you. Once I decide where I'm going to be searching, then I need to set up my search strategies for each author. And then I run the searches, and I might set up alerts at this point, or I might send the information to the person who's collecting this information so they can set up the alerts on their end. And I also need to figure out how I'm going to save and collect and organize the publications as I find them. EndNote is a really great resource to house all of this citation information. Some teams prefer to use Excel or Word documents, but if you start out with an EndNote library, you can export that information into Excel or Word in various styles per the needs of your team. And in this presentation, I'm going to be talking mostly about steps 3, 4, and 5, with the caveat that I'll be searching Scopus and PubMed in these demonstrations. And I also want to say that I will be focusing mostly on articles, published articles, rather than conference proceedings. There are so many challenges to searching conference proceedings that it's really not feasible to collect that information in a very sophisticated manner. Usually when you're searching for conference proceedings, you're just kind of doing a lot of Googling, you're relying on your team to self-report, because not every conference publishes the abstracts and the proceedings and who presented at that conference in a very searchable manner. So sometimes you can find this information quite easily. Most of the time you can't. So that is just a whole different conundrum for a team if they're specifically looking for conference proceedings. Okay, so I'm going to start out with PubMed and performing author searches in here. I'm going to go out into PubMed and do the searching live, but I do have slides here that show the steps. And I just want to point out here in PubMed, the advanced search areas where you'll be headed, where you should be headed to. And generally when I'm searching for authors, I've got my list of the people who I'll be searching for. The best practice is to create individual author searches one by one for each person in your department, run those searches, and then save those searches so that you can put it together for a group search. When I go into PubMed, I'm putting in a plug now for PubMed Linkout, which is MCW Libraries, the the links that you find on MCW Library's website. So these PubMed link out links connect you to our subscription holdings. So if you're looking to get from the abstract to the full text of the article, PubMed link out is the way to do that using the Get It buttons. Okay, so going into advanced search here, I'm going to use Dr. Aufderheide as my example. And note here that the default is to search any field of a PubMed record. This includes the title, the conference, or the book, the title, sorry, the date it was published, journal information, things like that. But here I want to limit specifically to authors. So I change this to the author search, and then I start typing in my faculty or researcher's last name. And PubMed has an index in the background where every time an author is added or indexed into PubMed, it gets saved in this index that's you can quickly pull up if you're using the field searches here. So when I start typing in Aufderheide, I can see variations of his name that show up down below. So a couple things to note here. First of all, if I search Aufderheide Tom, I'll also be getting anything with initials after it as default. Like it'll search Tom plus anything that comes after Tom. You also see Aufderheide TP. So sometimes when a journal submits their publication information to a database, they'll submit the full author name. Other journals will only submit the author's name with their initials. So just doing a search of Tom won't pull in all of his records. It's really good practice to do both variations of his name. It's just journals are not always following the same procedures and protocols. So this is just something to keep in mind. So I'll add his name here, and then I can add in the other variation by starting all over again and finding his initials. In PubMed, I'm going to add this with an or add it with an or. So I'm asking PubMed to look up Aufderheide Tom or Aufderheide Tom P or TP. So either one of these terms should be pulled up. And here's my search. So I can browse through the records here and just kind of double check to make sure that these are mostly his records. With some authors, let me think of a name that's more common. Let's try Dr. Long, who is in central Wisconsin. So I'm going to try looking up his name here and adding it to the query to see what comes up with just his name. And there are a couple articles here. This wasn't a very good example. Let me try this again with a different. Let's see about, we'll just use a generic name here like Smith and David. When I run a search, I'll probably find, thousands of articles here. So something I might want to do for someone with a unique name is to go into the advanced search and also add in an affiliation, which can be found here as one of the fields. So I can type in Medical College of Wisconsin. And now I'm asking PubMed to also look up in the affiliation or address section so that it makes sure David Smith is also associated with the Medical College of Wisconsin. So here this gets a little tricky. When I add it, I'm going to add it with and. So it's Medical College of Wisconsin and David Smith. And then when I run the search here, I should be finding articles that have both of these criteria in the search. And I found 9 articles here. One thing I do have to do when I'm at this point is kind of eyeball these records and see, is this David Smith really from MCW, or is someone else in the search or the author list here from MCW? So this can get a little bit tricky when you've got people with common last names. You can do things like add the affiliation, but you just have to make sure that the affiliation is directly tied to the author, which PubMed doesn't get that specific. So when I'm performing searches for a group, I'll take these, if I get a pretty decent search, I'll take this search strategy here and save it probably in an Excel spreadsheet so that I have that information and I can tie all of the searches together for a big group search. And I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. So, PubMed, you can search by author. You just have to be aware that some authors have unique names. You can add in additional information to try to pull out only articles by that specific author, but PubMed can only get so specific with your searches. Questions about PubMed so far? So these are the steps that I have on my slides that you can refer back to later on. Some tips for PubMed is you can take the articles that you're finding and send them to my bibliography. And as I said earlier, my bibliography is this holding spot that you can use in the NIH websites to hold citation records for yourself, your group, or your team, or whomever you want to collect those citations for. You can also create alerts on your searches in PubMed. So this shows up anytime you run a search in PubMed, you can create an alert on that, and you can set it up for weekly or monthly or daily alerts. And then I have some information here about for authors with unique names, consider adding institution information using the affiliation filter, and then keep track of these searches so that you can use them for future purposes. Okay, moving on to Scopus. This is another resource you can use to search for authors. And Scopus does have an author tab. So you can run your searches directly in that author tab. So I'm going to go out to Scopus and show you how that's done. So back on the library's homepage, MCW Libraries, if I go down a little bit here, I can find Scopus under popular databases. And here I can click on authors and use the author tab. I'm going to search Dr. Long. So it's asking for a last name and a first name. I can add affiliation here, but usually I wait to do that until I see if there's too many authors to go through. I hold off. But if I come up with a really long list, I can add affiliation down here. So there are different Roy Long authors out there, but I can see here what their affiliations are. So I'm going to choose this first person on the list because his affiliation is listed as Medical College of Wisconsin. Sometimes for some authors, you might see the same person listed twice with two different affiliations. If you know for a fact that that is the same person, it's just they maybe moved recently and Scopus hasn't figured that out yet, there is a way to request to merge authors. So you can do that on behalf of somebody. You do need to sign into an account in Scopus in order to do that. And then Scopus will work with you via email to make sure that the combined authors were in fact combined. So it's important to point out that this author profile is generated by Scopus using an algorithm that tries to detect patterns in publishing and affiliation information, and which fields the author is publishing in. So it collects all that information and then puts those publications in an author profile. These author profiles are only created for people who have 2 or more publications in Scopus that Scopus has identified as belonging to the same person. So these aren't infallible. You do have to look through the list here to make sure that the publications are in fact that researcher's publications. And you can request edits to this profile if you notice the wrong information showing up. Something that's important to note when you're doing author searches in Scopus is the Scopus author ID. So this is a unique identifier tied to this person. So I can feel confident knowing that when I type in this author ID, I'm only going to find records by Roy Long from MCW in just articles by that person. So when I'm doing my Scopus searches, I collect this information and then document it in a spreadsheet. And then later I can string together the Scopus author IDs to create a search for my entire department. I can set up individual alerts for this author. So if I've got a couple people on my research team, I can set up individual alerts for each person, or I can set up a group alert after I run the search for my entire department. Going back to the slides, I've got step-by-step instructions here on how to do author searches in Scopus and some things to note. And some tips for using Scopus. Here you can see in my advanced search area how I took multiple author IDs and strung them together. So when you're using advanced search in Scopus, you do have to use field tags to indicate which field specifically you want to look in when you type in the information. An AU-ID means author ID. So I can put multiple of these together and then run a big search. And then again, just to note that you do need to sort of keep an eye on your Scopus profiles here to make sure that all the publications are in fact yours. And you can request edits to the profile if you notice that the information isn't displayed correctly. So as you can imagine, going through these databases, it is a bit of work setting up individual author searches for each person in your group, but the bulk of the work is done once at the beginning of the project. Once you've collected those nice PubMed searches and gotten the Scopus author IDs, the process going forward is pretty straightforward. You can set up those alerts or use those searches that you've created and just query the databases periodically. But there is some front end work that you do have to do in order to do this process. I'm going to briefly mention Google Scholar here. So there is a way to set up a profile for a research group. And I found an article here that shows how to do this. The article has step-by-step instructions. I haven't followed the instructions yet, and I haven't created one of these Google Scholar searches. But if you're interested in doing it, I've got a link to this article in the slide deck, and you're welcome to try it. If you'd like to consult on this, I'd be happy to test it out with a group or two just to see how this works. But according to the article, it's pretty straightforward. Not sure if I can take their word for it, but it seems they've got all the instructions listed there. Okay, so documenting the searches, I said this a couple times, but I like to use a spreadsheet to do this. So here in this example, I've got my authors that I'm tracking. I've got a PubMed column where I've got my PubMed searches for each author. And then I also have a column for Scopus. And not every author in my group might have a Scopus ID. You do have to have those 2 publications in Scopus in order to get the ID. So my spreadsheet here, I keep my searches, and then next year, or as new faculty are added or removed, or new researchers are added or removed from your team, I can just make notes on the spreadsheet and then update my searches. And once I've got all the information listed here, I can take that and put it into a Word document. So this is my PubMed search. I could just copy and paste it into PubMed and run the searches, or I can set up my alerts and just get the notifications when new publications come in. So this is what PubMed looks like, and this is what a Scopus ID search looks like. Again, a lot of work on the front end, but once this is set up, maintenance isn't too terribly demanding. So as you collect all these publications, you do have to save them somewhere. And my preferred place to save citations is an EndNote. And I've got a big note here that if you want to use EndNote for this and you have questions about it, you can always request an appointment with the library to figure out how to best use EndNote for your team. But some of the reasons why I like to use EndNote is because I can easily import references after I run those searches in the database. I can take the results and just very easily send them into EndNote. I can organize references in folders. So sometimes I'll organize references by calendar or fiscal year, or by author name, or by grant number that I'm tracking. So you can organize. You can also remove your duplicate articles pretty easily. So as you're pulling in results from PubMed and Scopus and other sources, you will find duplicate articles listed. And with EndNote, there's a find duplicate function that helps you identify those really easily. And EndNote libraries can be shared in a central location. Because EndNote can be downloaded directly onto your computer and it's not saved in the cloud, unless you ask it to be saved in the cloud, you can take an EndNote library and save it on a shared drive. And then whoever has access to EndNote in your department who needs to get access to that library can get to it if they have EndNote installed on their computer. Just a note that right now EndNote's kind of running two versions, EndNote X9 and EndNote 20. You can only have a library in either the X9 or the 20 version. So if you're sharing this library with a group, make sure you're all on the same page for that. And then finally, once your citations are in EndNote, if your group needs the citations put into Excel, you can create an EndNote export where you can easily just copy your formatted references into an Excel spreadsheet. Or if you're creating a publication report for your maybe your annual review, or you want to share it with someone, you can export in any citation style that you could dream of using the references that you have stored in EndNote. So do you have any questions right now about the process? I'm going to be moving into the FCD next. All right, moving on to the FCD. This is the Faculty Collaboration Database. Although faculty is becoming a bit of a misnomer, recently we've started adding more and more people into the Faculty Collaboration Database. So we've got the advanced practice providers are all have research profiles in the FCD. And then most recently, we started adding research scientists to the FCD. So if you're in one of these groupings through HR, you will get a profile loaded in the FCD. If there's people in your department who are publishing who aren't in these statuses or staff statuses, you can contact the FCD and we can look into getting more groups added. So the FCD is a research profiling system for MCW and for the entirety of CTSI. And for faculty, APPs, and research scientists, you get a profile that's automatically created in the FCD, and others in other CTSI institutions can request profiles in the FCD. And you might want a profile in here to showcase your research experience and expertise, and to have others be able to find you for potential collaboration. So with the FCD, I put my little easy icon here. So that whole process I talked about earlier about running searches for the faculty in your department, you can really use the FCD to kind of automate the entire process for you. And you can run publication reports for your department, your division, or center through the FCD. And the nice thing about running these reports is that all the publications that come up on the report are author verified records. So you don't have to scan the articles from PubMed to see if Brian Smith is actually the Brian Smith from MCW. If Brian Smith had an FCD profile, they would go ahead and say, yes, that's me, check a box to verify it, and then add it to their publication list that you see on the FCD profile pages. And these publications show up in the reports that the FCD runs. So if your department is using the FCD and keeping these profile lists current, the reporting feature is really a dream. And in order to get to the publication reports, you do need to log into the FCD. So if you have an FCD profile, you can log in. But if you don't have an FCD profile, you can contact FCD to request an account, and we'll set up that designee account for you. So with an FCD account, you can run publication reports. You can also request access to people on your team to make sure that their publication lists are kept current and accurate. So the reporting feature shows up when you're logged into the FCD on the left side of the page under reports and under publication. And here's a sample of the report that's produced. So on the screen, you can dictate the time frame that you want the report to be run. There's some other selections here about looking for journals that fall under certain impact factors ranges. And then you can denote which department or division or center you want the report to be run for. And then on the screen, you'll see information like the source of the information. So did the records here come from PubMed or Scopus? Whose author profile the publication showed up on? There's citation information. This CC number was recently added. These are citation counts that come from Scopus. So on the day that you run the report, how many times were the articles on this list cited according to the Scopus database? So that's some good information there if you're looking at that type of calculation. The reports also feature impact factors, and these are loaded into the FCD each year as the new impact factors are released. And the reports tell you whether or not the FCD or the journal is from a top tier journal. And the top tier journals are within the top quartile of impact factors. And this is, MCW has a push to publish in top tier journals. So that's something to be aware of. And then the first and last author. So I see a question in chat about FCD only searching PubMed and Scopus, and I'll show it. So yes, Wes just answered that. So there are automatic searches done on PubMed and Scopus, but you can also add in any publications manually that are missing from those reports. And we'll show that in a couple minutes. And by the way, Wes Rude is here, and Wes does all the back-end programming of the FCD. So anytime enhancements are made or requested, it goes through Wes and he makes it all happen. So if we have specific questions about how the FCD works, we've got Wes around to answer those. So going back to the publication report, you can download the report and you get a couple more fields that are included in the report, like the Scopus and PubMed IDs and other information. So going back to where those publications come from that show up on the report. So every faculty or researcher who has a profile in the FCD, when their profile is created, there's this automatic search that's set up in the background. It's a PubMed search. And you'll see here for this author, Ling H, this is a person with a pretty common name. So when this search was run in PubMed, this automatically created search, there's over 1,500 articles that show up on this list. Now that's a ridiculous amount of articles to look through. So what I would do is go in and modify this PubMed search to probably include their full name and maybe include an institution, just something to get this number down to a more manageable number. So these automatically created PubMed searches can be modified at any time. Once you modify the search and rerun it, this list of unconfirmed publications gets wiped out, and then a new list shows up of just those articles. Oops. You can also add a Scopus author ID to the search. And some reasons why you'd want to add a Scopus author ID is because Scopus pulls from more sources than PubMed. So sometimes journal articles show up in Scopus before they show up in PubMed. Sometimes they show up only in Scopus and never in PubMed. Your researchers might be producing content like book chapters that you wouldn't necessarily find in PubMed. So adding a Scopus author ID will give you a more complete result, a more complete reflection of the articles you've published. In this unconfirmed list here, if an article shows up in both PubMed and Scopus, the list is pretty smart in detecting duplicates, so you should only see the article once in your list. Once your researchers go through and confirm or reject the articles, they're on your record, or they're in this holding area that says, don't show me these articles ever again because they're not mine. Once this is cleaned up, you can feel confident that your profile has all of your publications accurately represented. If you're running reports for your entire team, so you want to do a report for cell biology, you might want to request an engagement report from the FCD. to see how many unconfirmed publications there are for the people who are listed under your division or department. You can also see when the last time they logged in was, how many, if they've got a Scopus and PubMed search listed in their FCD profile. So all of this can give you a little bit of contextual information to determine whether or not the people whose publications you're pulling are keeping their profiles up to date. And if they aren't up to date, you can either tap them on the shoulder and ask them to get their profiles up to date, or you can assign a designee to take care of that on behalf of the researcher. Again, some people come in and see this 1,500 unconfirmed publications and then get overwhelmed and may not want to keep their publications up to date because of that. But just note that you can modify the PubMed search to get this to a much more manageable number. And then once your publications list is cleaned up, odds are you only have to log in a couple times a year to confirm or reject those publications. And as I said a little bit earlier, if a publication isn't showing up in PubMed or Scopus, you can always add publications in either with a PMID or manually adding references in. So this will take care of those extra one-off publications that you don't find in these database searches. So I really can't say enough about these FCD publication reports. For some departments, I've taken to just using this for the most part for collecting those publications for that department, if I can see that these that their publication list is kept current and that there's no outstanding unconfirmed publications. Okay, so just kind of comparing the three sources that I talked about, we've got PubMed, Scopus, and the FCD. So with PubMed, when you're doing author searches, you have to get a little creative. You may need to add in additional information besides just the author name when you're running the search. You do need to manually verify the authorship because PubMed isn't super precise about how authors are listed. But you can run those search alerts, which are very handy. That's a great way to keep up to date on the content that your research team is producing without much effort. Once that search alert's set up, you can just sit back and let the alerts come in to notify you. And you can also easily export the results into EndNote for holding of your group's publications, or you can put them in My Bibliography, which is another storage spot. For Scopus, the author IDs are super convenient. However, they're machine generated and not always 100% correct. So you do need to periodically review the authorship to make sure that the articles are in fact belong to the researcher. And PubMed and Scopus both may miss out on some publications that are included in one resource and not the other, or neither. With Scopus, you can also export the results to EndNote pretty easily, and you can set up search alerts for your research team. So the FCD here pulls in searches from Scopus and PubMed, so it does that on the back end for you. The authors are verifying their publications, so you don't have to scan through the list and really do some detective work to determine, is that publication really part of your research team, or do the authors just share similar names or affiliations? With Scopus, authors can manually import or add publications that aren't found in either of these two resources, and that shouldn't be a lot. It should be just some one-offs here and there. With FCD, you can generate those reports and they come as an Excel document. So one thing about that is, in order to get the information from the Excel spreadsheet into EndNote, you do have to do a little bit of work for that. So the way I do it is I take the publication IDs that come with the report and I run those searches and then export the results into EndNote. So that process does take a couple extra steps, but it's really straightforward. And then also with the FCD, the report only includes people with FCD profiles. So there may be people on your team, like students, who are publishing articles that may not show up in the FCD because they don't have a profile. However, think about your research group. If you're all publishing articles together and there's at least one or two researchers on your team who have FCD profiles, that could be a great place to gather that information. All right, so we've got 15 minutes or so for questions, and we have Wes available. So if you do have questions about what I talked about or specific FCD questions, please share them now. Okay, so a recording and the slide deck will be sent out after or a link to the recording and the slide deck will be shared out after the session for anyone who registered for it. So those will be coming out. The FCD doesn't give you metrics. So the FCD, let me actually show you that because there are some cool metrics included in that. For specific questions about using EndNote, you can call the library. If it's about installing EndNote, that's MCW IT, so they can help you install EndNote. But if the question is about using EndNote, you can contact the library. And as long as I'm on the library homepage, let me show you where. Down here, you can email us, chat with us, request an appointment if you want to learn about EndNote, but otherwise email or chat is your best option. So let me get into the FCD and show some of the metrics that are available. I always can never think of who to do an author search for. So let's go back to Dr. Dr. Heidi. And thank goodness for the FCD spelling corrections here. So some of the metrics you'll find in FCD are listed out for each citation in this publications list. If you click on the article record, you'll find PubMed metrics. So these are alt metrics that kind of show who's shared this information, who's commented it on social media. Alt metric donut provides some of the same information. You'll also see citation counts, and they're listed here. So this is in Scopus, how many times was this article cited? This citation count can also be included in that report that you run for your department. It's in the publication report. But these altmetric badges here are pretty neat to look at and pretty helpful. And they just show up here. There's a little bit of color to them, so you can see where the altmetrics show up. And then there was a question about distinguishing between published abstracts and published articles in the FCD, this publication list. So no, it's not. In this publications list here, it can be challenging to distinguish between the two. You kind of have to have an eye for that. So typically an abstract will be published in a supplement and it'll have very few page numbers. So that's a cue to me that it's an abstract and not a publication. So that you do have to eyeball to kind of distinguish between publications and abstracts. And I'm looking through here, seeing if there's anything I can really pick out as an abstract. And not yet. So you do have to have a careful eye to search that. Oftentimes too, abstracts will just show up in Scopus and you won't see the PubMed record for it because PubMed typically doesn't include conference abstracts. So that is one thing you have to be aware of if you're using this publication report for your team. I'm going to sign in here and run a quick report for a department. And I'm going to use cell biology as an example. So here I can see, in the last couple months, how many articles are written. Something that is interesting to note here is that this article here, you can see this measuring cardiomyocyte cell cycle activity shows up twice. And that's because this publication is listed on 2 profiles. This is helpful information to show the collaboration within your team. You can always deduplicate these articles in EndNote if you do a search for, in either EndNote or in Excel, if you want to do a search on, a search on duplicate values. When I download the report here, it shows up in Excel with these extra cells or extra pieces of data. Oops. And then with this report here, I can see how many are top tier articles. So what shows up on that top tier list that the Office of Research publishes every year. You can see whose profiles the article shows up on, who the first and last authors are. So this is helpful and to show kind of who's, to show prestige. And then these are the IDs. So if I want to get this information into an EndNote library, I can run a search on these PM IDs and then export everything into EndNote, as well as a search on these Scopus IDs and then export that into EndNote. And then I've got all that information in one spot. Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to put a plug in for some upcoming library classes and events. So we do our monthly orientations for the library orientation and then EndNote essentials. So if you have questions about using EndNote, or if it's, PubMed essentials. If you haven't used PubMed in a while, I highly recommend this PubMed essentials class. In the chat box, I'm typing in a evaluation form for this webinar. If you could please fill this out, it would really help us. There's also a question about future webinars. So if there's topics you'd like to see in these scholarly communications webinars, please let us know and we'll look into hosting those. There's a question here about what do you recommend for social science publications? So Scopus has a pretty decent, I'd say it's one of my go-to ones for searching the social sciences. Scopus is a collection of databases that includes social sciences topics. Web of Science has as well, but I've found there's a lot of duplicates between the two. So setting up those Scopus searches or Scopus IDs in the FCD will help identify those publications that come from social sciences. Upcoming scholarly communications webinars, we've got 2 next month about open access. So the first one's about just general overview of what open access is. And then following that, we've got 4 authors who've published in open access who are going to share their thoughts on it, how they went through the process, how they funded it, their views on it. So if you have questions about publishing in the open access model, I highly recommend coming to this author perspective panel. And then in July, we're doing a webinar about systematic reviews. So from publication to protocol, if you or people on your team are thinking about doing a systematic review, this webinar will really show you all the steps that are involved in the process to kind of get you ready for doing that. I am available afterwards for any questions. You can contact me via email or email is probably the easiest way to get a hold of me, or you can send questions to the library. And if you're setting up these publication searches for your department, I'd be happy to consult with you on how to get that going. And then look for an email with a link to the recording and the slide deck. And thank you all for attending today.